Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. Ukrainian troops are gaining ground in Russia, and the developments are fast moving. Here to explain exactly what is happening and what it means for the outcome of the conflict is Stephen Sestanovich. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a professor with 20 years of experience, and he is also an ambassador under the Clinton administration. Steve, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure.
There has been a lot of news from the Ukraine-Russia border, and some is minute by minute. So acknowledging that this is an ever-evolving situation, can you just explain for us what we know right now and what we've been seeing over the last few hours and days?
Sure. Today, what one knows is that the Ukrainian government is claiming that they have taken about 1,000 square kilometers. The numbers vary. Sometimes it's 500 square kilometers of Russian territory across their northern border. This is an offensive that has been underway for almost 10 days. It was a big surprise to the Russians, to the US government and other Western partners of Ukraine who apparently were not aware of it in advance. And day by day, there are new developments, although some of the momentum on the Ukrainian side may be slowing a little bit. The best way to understand the significance of this move by Ukraine is to compare it with the situation that existed before their new offensive. At that time, you had a situation on the ground in between Russia and Ukraine on the front lines in eastern Ukraine. It was largely static, but with some gradual Russian advances. You had Putin at home looking as though he was managing to hold down the domestic costs of this war effort. You had questions about Ukrainian morale. You had questions about Western support, increased talk about the need for negotiations. And, broadly, the issue was how long would Ukraine and its Western backers be able to sustain this effort? So that was 10 days ago.
Right.
And now, what do we see? Well, you have this stunning, bold stroke by the Ukrainian military, the first real seizure of Russian territory since the war started 2.5 years ago. You have Putin clearly on the defensive. He's furious with his generals. He's having to evacuate people from these territories in eastern Ukraine, more than 130,000 people out. He's declared martial law in these territories. And the Ukrainians are, of course, ecstatic. Enthusiasm for the government and the military alike is greater than it's been in some time. The unity of the political elite and the population, also great. You have Western governments impressed. Remember, in the first few months of the war, people used to talk about the ingenuity and creativity of the Ukrainians. We hadn't heard that in a while. Now we hear it again. And if there's talk about negotiations, it's with the Ukrainians holding a new bargaining chip. So 10 days ago, the war changed in an important way. What we don't know is how long that change is going to last.
I was just going to ask you, it feels like a fundamental turning point, and obviously we don't have crystal balls, but what's your sense of how this changes the momentum and perhaps maybe brings an end to the conflict?
Well, bringing an end to the conflict is that's a tall order. And maybe further into the future than we can really peer, since I think you said we have no crystal balls, right? But let's still look, though, at what choices this forces on Putin, for example. I mean, he's the guy who's thrown back on his heels, who has to figure out, what the hell do I do now? He obviously wants to stop or reverse the gains that the Ukrainian forces have made. But how does he do that? You know, he can bring more troops from the existing front lines in eastern Ukraine so as to thwart the Ukrainian advance. He can redeploy from elsewhere in Russia. He can issue a new draft call, conscription, grabbing people on the street. He can increase military attacks on other targets in Ukraine, including cities and infrastructure. Believe me, since I'm going to be there next month, I'm worried about the attacks on cities and infrastructure. But there are problems with each of these options for Putin. If he brings troops from elsewhere in eastern Ukraine, he's going to slow or maybe stop his own offensive. He won't be able to say, we're gaining ground. He won't be able to say, we now really control and occupy all of the provinces of Ukraine that we formally annexed. With both redeployments from elsewhere in Russia and new conscriptions, there are questions about the quality of the troops that you'd have, also about the political consequences. In Russia, people have assumed that Putin really wanted to avoid new draft calls, and he's been successful at that. Can he continue to turn back this new offensive by the Ukrainians without more troops? And if he increases military attacks on other targets in Ukraine, the cities and infrastructure that I mentioned, it may do little to push the Ukrainians back from Russian territory. So he's got a set of options, none of them looking really good, at a time when he's sitting down at the table with his generals, with his intelligence officials, and he doesn't have a lot of confidence in them. So he is, let's say, not a happy guy this week.
Interesting. And let's talk about President Zelensky, Ukrainian President Zelensky, for a second, because you mentioned that this incursion was a bit of a surprise to European and American allies. How did he and his military finagle this?
They are being given a lot of credit by Western governments and Western military officials of a grudging kind. They're saying, you know, the Ukrainians' operational security here was great. Western governments could see where Ukrainian troops were moving, but they, no more than the Russians themselves, knew what the movement of those troops meant. And I think their awe is real. What's interesting now is what kind of effect this has on Western policy calculations. You know, in announcing the latest successes of the Ukrainian offensive, President Zelensky said, you know, we need more weapons, better weapons. We need fewer restrictions on them. Yesterday, there was one of the biggest Ukrainian drone attacks so far on Russian airfields, some of them even east of Moscow. And those were all drones made in Ukraine. President Zelensky said about this, these drones are good, but they're not as good as missiles. They're not as good as weapons that we can only get from the West. And so he is trying to increase the pressure on Western governments to help him. One issue will be, does this greater enthusiasm and confidence in the Ukrainians' ability to transform the military situation, even at the margin, does it translate into a greater accelerated supply of weapons? There's another issue for President Zelensky, of course, and that is how to limit the risk that these gains will be reversed. You know, I said Putin was not a happy guy and that he faces a lot of not good options, but he still has the opportunity to roll back the Ukrainian offensive if he can do so before they dig in too much and gain some of the advantages of new defensive fortifications. For President Zelensky, having this bold stroke be reversed, even worse, having his troops surrounded and taken prisoner, or having many casualties, that it would be part of a big defeat, retreat. All of that can quickly undo some of the political advantages that he's gained from this offensive. So he's got to figure out how to keep this new prize that he's won, this bright, shiny object that he's gained with this offensive, how to keep it from sort of just crumbling in his hands. This was, let's be honest, a risky operation, which we can't yet say is a durable success. We can say it was a stunning success, but so far brief. And the challenge for the Ukrainians and its Western supporters will be to try to hold the ground that has been gained and turn it into something meaningful, to put extra pressure on Putin, to wait for some of the domestic pressures on Putin to build. You know, people sometimes, this was again very much the outlook of 10 days ago. People think, you know, the Russians are so full of resilience and stamina and ability to suffer through adversity and so forth, and they use the examples of World War II. But World War I actually teaches a rather different example, a different lesson. 2.5 years into World War I, which is where we are now, you had a revolution in Russia because the war looked like a losing proposition that people didn't want to stick with. Putin has to cope with what is sure to be increased debate, increased disillusionment, and criticism, and he wants to try to take action that will quickly turn that new mood into something more confident.
Now, Steve, you mentioned this is so new, right? 10 days ago, this conflict looked very different. And one of the things that remains to be proven is if Ukraine holds its ground that it just regained. And there's reporting out today, just this afternoon, that Zelensky is saying that his troops have captured the town of Suja. It is a town, as we were discussing before we started recording, of just 5,000 people. But is that further advancement a sign that the Ukrainian troops are able to hold this new territory?
It's not a sign that they're able to hold it. It is a sign that they can consolidate their hold on some of the territory that they've already claimed, and they seem to have moved beyond it in some places. This will be the challenge for the Ukrainians. They have now moved as much as 20 kilometers or so into Russia and across a front that is, you know, some measures even as much as 100 kilometers. Although we don't have a really good grip on this, and the satellite photography is educating us on that every day. What we do know is that the Ukrainians are going to be digging in furiously to try to make it as hard as possible for the Russians to reverse this new advance, because the Ukrainians know that they were able to seize this territory because it was basically undefended. The Russians had built impressive defensive fortifications inside Ukraine along the front that they had created there. You may remember the term dragon's teeth to describe some of the obstacles that they built against a Ukrainian counteroffensive. They didn't build such fortifications north of the border inside Russia, and that gave the Ukrainians an opportunity to act. what the Ukrainians now want to do is make sure that they are not the victims of a reverse of another Russian counteroffensive against them because their defensive fortifications are not strong enough. So they've got their shovels out, they've got their logs and their concrete, and they're trying to build up quickly in order to make it difficult for the Russians to act and to regain some of this territory. You may see some of these lines moving quickly over the next several days, although I think from what we've seen so far, it looks as though the Russians are pausing and to try to figure out what the hell to do. We don't know yet that they have a strategy for how to act at this point, or any sense of how to assemble the military capabilities that would enable them to act effectively. That's something we're going to have to watch for. What is Putin's choice given his not so great options? One other thing to mention here is that while the political repercussions inside Russia are great, people are suddenly thinking, oh my God, Russians are having to be evacuated from their own territory. Nevertheless, if you look on a map, the little blue spot, the little blue wedge that the Ukrainians have taken inside Russia is very small compared to the territory that the Russians have seized inside Ukraine. That it can be a bargaining chip at all shows you how significant a psychological blow it is for Putin to have had this happen at all.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because when this news first broke, I looked at the map expecting to see a much larger swath of the map in Ukrainian colors in the site that I was looking at. And it does look very small, but it feels like a momentum shift. Talk a little bit about what this might mean for Western support for Ukraine, which in recent months felt like it was flagging a little bit.
Well, Western support at the beginning of the year was in doubt. The United States Congress had put on hold a bill providing for renewed assistance, military and economic assistance to Ukraine. And it was only in April that the Congress finally pulled itself together and voted that aid. In the interim, despite the congressional action, there has been more debate and some partisanship around the question of supporting Ukraine. And both former President Trump and J.D. Vance, his running mate especially, have questioned the Biden administration's policy of supporting Ukraine. And, one had to think that that was going to be an issue in the fall campaign. Not clear exactly how anybody was going to handle it, but with some anxiety, both in Ukraine and among our European allies, about the staying power of the United States. Now it looks as though there's a kind of renewed, I'd almost call it political glamour to the Ukrainian cause. This is, again, plucky David holding his own against the bumbling, aggressive Goliath. And I think there will be some new confidence among advocates of sustaining support for Ukraine and even of expanding it, because what the case that the Ukrainians are making is, you see what we can do with more support. We're not just doomed to cede ground to the Russians. We have opportunities to put the Russians on the defensive, and why aren't you going to help us? I think that may be a more powerful argument than it seemed 2 weeks ago.
Interesting. So does this do anything for Ukraine's case for getting into NATO?
Well, that's a gradual case. The NATO summit last month chose to reaffirm that Ukraine would eventually get into NATO, but it didn't create any sort of timetable or criteria for moving toward that ultimate outcome. What the summit did do was support the many bilateral arrangements that member states of the alliance have reached with Ukraine to create a permanent mechanism for support. And I think what you're seeing now is the way in which those agreements could operate. Individual countries led by a NATO consensus may feel more confident about giving greater support to Ukraine. Just this week, we've had the announcement of the first operational F-16 fighter jet deliveries and their introduction into Ukrainian forces. There are other items on the Ukrainian wish list that are doubtless going to be discussed in coming weeks and months. But again, the main boost that the Ukrainians get from the past 10 days is the ability to say to their Western partners, we can do this if you really help us.
It will be fascinating to watch this to continue to unfold. Steve Sestanovich, thank you so much for joining us and explaining what we know at this point in time.
We'll come back to this.